Hello out there, friends, and welcome to the Switch for Good podcast. I am Dotsie Bausch, and I'm alongside Alexandra Paul, and we were in the studio. We're not remote anymore. It feels like home again. Hey, girl.
Hey, I missed you.
I know. It was tough stuff. We have a pretty awesome guest today who is a Ph.D. in social science. And we're going to dive in as deep as we can into the ideas behind nature versus nurture. Both you and I struggled for years with eating disorders and had a very unhealthy relationship with food and our bodies for about 10 years, myself about 5 years.
I still have, I think, an unhealthy relationship. I could be way better. I know you've really, really recovered, but I aspire to have your kind of recovery.
Okay, well, we can work on that today. Maybe this turns into a therapy session for you. Okay, well, we didn't tell her what we're going to do that, but but I want to kind of dive into, before we get going with our doctor, with each other, what was the precipitous of your eating disorder in relation to the nurturing aspect of it? And what were you afraid of? What there's so many questions you could ask about an eating disorder, but I think what always comes up for me is what was I fearing in my life at the time? There was a lot of self-loathing going on too, and self-berating. But there were things that I was not comfortable with in my own skin and that I was fearful of. What was the beginnings and the precipitous to your bulimia?
Well, what I feel that it is, and I think our guests might argue that it's not that, but we'll see, is that I felt when I was a teen. Well, first of all, I saw girls who were seniors at the boarding school that I just started going to when I was a freshman talk about how they didn't like how they looked, and they started weighing themselves, and I was in shock because they were beautiful and I wanted to be just like them. And so if they weren't happy with their weight, then I must be really need to do some work and change myself. And then I got really sick. I had a blockage in my bile duct, and I was in the in isolation for a long time while they were trying to figure out what it was. And then I had a surgery that was 12 hours and took back in the 70s, they just opened you up, and a long recovery. And during that time, I lost weight. And when I got better, I never wanted to go back to the old Alexandra that was unhealthy, that had gotten sick in the first place, and that was heavier. And that was when, it was right after that I started trying to eat really, really healthily. And then I started taking out even more and more foods, and then the fear of going back to the old Alexandra, and I wanted to maintain my weight loss. And then it just got crazy. I became anorexic and then bulimic for the next 12 years. So I had a lot of trauma in my abdomen area, and I've actually always hated my abdomen too. That's where I carry my fat. And so I have had a battle with this area, I feel. And I've also had other surgeries there too for endometriosis and ectopic pregnancy and double hernia. So it's like a battleground.
Heavens.
Oh yeah. And I think
I
personally think that a lot of it is my psychology about that area that has made me. But so that's
trauma from all levels: physical, mental, emotional, every aspect of you as a being.
So my need to control was what I would say that I really was about, control. And I really felt like if you let me loose, I would eat everything in sight. And so and I was amazed about that people didn't binge and throw up. I just thought, how could they not? How could they not?
Yeah.
But then I went to OA. And within a month, after 12 years of therapy, I stopped. I stopped having that need to binge. I can't quite explain it. And maybe Dr. Howk can do that for us today.
Yeah. Was it about the suddenly having these other experiences that you could relate to?
Hearing other people
there's a big difference
rooms?
Between one-on-one therapy for 12 years and then in 30 days almost being able to heal. That would be what I would see as the biggest difference between individual therapy and group.
Yeah, I guess, no, I actually think it was the 12 steps, doing the 12 steps, actually having an active thing, therapy. And I think our guests might agree with me is that we talk about everything that went wrong in our childhood, and then we don't really talk about how to heal. What are the steps to have a productive, thriving life? And the 12 steps help me do that. But it doesn't mean that the therapy didn't help me, by the way. I think therapy helped me a lot. But I think I could have stayed there just talking about myself for years and years and years. I needed to take action.
That's interesting because that does go into nature, because both of us found a healing journey by taking steps. Because you know my story with the blue dots and everything. So let's get into
which our audience can hear when I interviewed you on this show quite a few episodes ago. I think that's episode like 32 or something. So very interesting story and heroic story. And that's why you've really, truly healed yourself. So, but I want to introduce our guest because she's super interesting, very, very smart. She has her own podcast also. Dr. Jen Howk is a psychology coach. She's a writer, a lecturer at True North Health Center, where she used to be the director. And True North is an inpatient water fasting facility that helps people adopt especially those with severe health problems, adopt a very, very healthy plant-based diet that includes no sugar, no oil, and very little salt, or maybe no salt. She also has her own podcast, the Beat Your Genes podcast, with Dr. Doug Lisle, who's also a co-author with her on a book that they're writing. Dr. Doug Lisle wrote The Pleasure Trap, which is a very, very interesting book we're going to talk about also today. So Dr. Jen Howk, we're so glad to have you on the show.
It is exciting to see you guys actually like physically in a studio together. I didn't even notice that until you said it, but I was struck and didn't know why I was struck, but it's like humans in the same room together. It's fantastic. So yeah, I'm delighted to be here and to tackle any and all questions that you guys have on these topics. So let's take it away.
Well, I first want to start with your a little bit about where you grew up. You grew up in Alaska, and then you went to Harvard, and then you've come to California. You're soon moving to Hawaii. You are just going farther and farther west, and so
seeking warmer weather.
And you studied evolutionary psychology at Harvard, and you are considered yourself an evolutionary psychologist. Can you tell us a little bit about what got you interested in that? It seems like a very far cry from Alaska.
Yeah, it is. I didn't technically study evolutionary psychology at Harvard, so my degree is in political science, of all things. I was very interested growing up in Russia. This is like I actually grew up knowing Sarah Palin, the former vice presidential nominee, quite well. I'm from the same little tiny town called Wasilla, and so she's famous for the sort of statement about we have this close relationship with Russia, and that was actually very true for me. So my father was news director at the public radio station in Anchorage, and was very involved with the Soviet collapse. So when the Soviet Union was coming to the end of its long experimental history, he was very involved. He was traveling over and interviewing people and very interested in that sort of moment in human history. And that sort of, got me interested in politics, got me interested in Soviet politics, and the ways in which humans can make wildly different institutions to govern their societies that lead to incredibly different outcomes across population. And I stumbled very early in my education, even before I was even an undergrad, into some evolutionary psychology type thinking. So the sort of, we can very loosely think of evolutionary psychology as much less about what we would call nurture and much more about nature. So, who are humans really before these kinds of institutional rules get to them? And the evolutionary psychology point of view would say that humans have a nature. They have a human nature, like any animal has a nature, and it kind of doesn't matter what country you plop that person down into. They're going to express themselves the same way. They're going to pursue the same kind of goals in life, across cultural barriers, across differences. So this is really opposite of what I was being trained to think of in terms of formal political science training, which was very much the rules matter. That shapes the human. So I was struggling with this dichotomy for a very long time, and reading things in evolutionary psychology. There was a book called The Moral Animal that I came across very early, little just bits and pieces here and there. But it really wasn't until I was fairly late in my degree process that I came across Dr. Lyle's work, my co-author and collaborator in Esteem Dynamics. So Dr. Lyle is really he's the only psychologist who is approaching clinical problems from an evolutionary psychology perspective. Most people trained in evolutionary psychology thinking are academics. So they're very abstract. They're writing books about sort of abstract problems in human problem solving, but they're not applying it one-on-one in sessions with real people who are dealing with real relationship issues in their romances and their friendships and their jobs. And so Dr. Lyle really is, he brought that kind of thinking to the clinical realm. And once I came across that, I realized the incredible power that had. And that really resonated with me as an incredible tool to change people's lives in a really profound sense. And it changed my life before I started using it with my own clients and applying it in my coaching practice. I applied these principles to my own life and my own issues with the pleasure trap. I was an alcoholic for many years. I'm 7 years sober now, but I was 100 pounds overweight, alcoholic, had problems, and was very much trapped by a lot of the predictable traps that we talk about in Esteem Dynamics, trying to solve motivational and relationship problems in these kinds of maladaptive ways that emerge from the modern environment, which are not how we would have tried to solve these things in the Stone Age. So it's evolutionary psychology is all about how did we try to solve problems in the Stone Age, and how is that ill-suited for the kind of environment we're in now.
So you mentioned the pleasure trap. So
yeah.
Can you define the pleasure trap?
Yeah, so the pleasure trap is the name that Dr. Lyle and Dr. Goldhammer gave to the idea that we are Stone Age creatures. We're Stone Age animals who essentially evolved in a very specific context. And we evolved in that context around all of the problems that we try to solve. But most relevantly, the main problems we always solved in our ancestral history was getting enough food. That was the biggest problem we had. And, successfully finding mates to reproduce our DNA. So survival and reproduction. These are the core problems of the human species, just like they're the core problems of every species. So we always begin there. What is the survival and reproduction reality of any problem that we're facing? And more of our ancestors were killed by starvation than anything else. That was the thing that really took out most of the ancestors who came before us. It wasn't predators, it wasn't disease, it was starvation. So when you realize that that's the case, all throughout our evolutionary history, we were adapting ways to solve that problem. How can we become a more efficient animal that is not so likely to be taken out by starvation problems, because we kept facing them? So we adapted really efficient strategies for finding calorie-dense food, for putting on and keeping on weight, and for preferring calorie-dense food. All things equal, we are always going to seek out the richest food in the environment. You hand us a slice of pizza and a kale salad, we want the pizza. It tastes better. It's more exciting to us because it's more advantageous for our survival and reproduction. So with that, this is the animal that we are. This is what we evolved to do. And so the pleasure trap is the name that the doctors Lyle and Goldhammer gave to the trap we find ourselves in the modern environment, which is awash with calorie-rich food for the first time in our evolutionary history. We've never had access to this abundance, and we've never had access to this sort of artificially processed, hyper-stimulating, hyper-calorie-dense food everywhere we look. And so because we're adapted to seek out that food, we're invariably drawn to it, but there's too much of it. So it's a trap. It's fooling our adaptive mechanisms, which have told us for millions of years it's always the right thing to do, to eat the thing with the most calories per bite. It's disastrous not to. So now that's all we have. And so we systematically overeat. So it's a trap. It's hijacking our built-in survival cues.
So with those two core survivals, I've always wondered, and I think you're the person to ask, we've known that it was mostly seeking food, right, for survival and how to share our DNA and how to reproduce. What happens over time in our nurturing, if that is even the reason, where people like Alexandra and I don't have a desire to reproduce?
Don't have I missed you just at the end there. You don't have a desire to
reproduce.
Sure. Well, I don't either. So
okay,
I
right.
never,
There's lots of us, but
yeah.
We're speaking personally.
So what happens is, we were never supposed to, as a species, really understand quite where babies came from. We just have built-in mechanisms to pursue the things that lead to the creation of babies. So we can understand in the modern environment forms of birth control and ways to avoid having children and reproducing our DNA. But we're still driven at the basic cellular level to engage in things that would, in principle, lead to reproduction. So romantic behavior, getting esteem signals from potential romantic partners, engaging in displays, or what evolutionary psychology calls fitness indicators, to display to potential mates and to potential people in the village our gene quality and who we are as people that makes us more attractive as someone to mate with and be friends with. All of those things are reproductive behavior, even though they don't necessarily result in actually having a child. So in the modern environment, we have this ability to modulate whether we actually literally reproduce or not, but it doesn't change the fundamental motivational drives that we have.
So we still have sex, we just try not to have babies.
Right, sure, yeah. And even if you're not interested in sex, you're still interested in reproductive, the sort of behavior that would aid your reproductive capacity in the Stone Age, looking pretty, wearing nice clothes, making your house look nice. All of these things that we do, these are ways that we're advertising who we are. The way that the car that you buy, the clothes that you wear, the way that you decorate your home, these are advertisements of your genetic fitness to anybody who might come across it. There's no other reason that we engage in these things. We're just like little birds feathering our nests, showing off with our peacock feathers who it is that we are. And most of the time we're doing that to potentially appeal to the highest quality mate that we can find. Whether we're consciously aware of that or not, that's sort of always the game that we're in. So we want to look as good as we can. We want to have as many pieces of bling and peacock feathers to show off that genetic fitness, because that makes us more desirable. That produces more successful children. The whole game, it's not just reproduction per se. You're not just interested in having babies and that's it. You're interested in having a very high quality baby who's also very attractive, who has very attractive personality characteristics, who will be very successful in their own reproduction efforts and attempts. So your lineage continues for a long time without your direct involvement. This is why humans are we're the only species in the world that cares about who our children date. You don't have mama aardvarks who are all worried about like who their little baby aardvarks are hooking up with. But humans are very interested in who their children are connecting with, potentially romantically, the lives of their grandchildren. All of these things are really important to human psychology. And that all constitutes what we would call reproductive behavior, even though it's not a wham, bam, thank you, ma'am sort of exchange.
So what would have become unhinged in that final step for the three of us in terms of we are still seeking all of these types of behaviors that would lead to reproduction, but then completely uninterested in actual reproduction? What would have...
I think that's a luxury of the modern environment. So I don't think you would have had a lot of women who would have been aware that they even had that preference in the Stone Age. And if they had, they wouldn't have had a lot of choice about it, because it was until very recently in our evolutionary history, it really wasn't an option for women to opt out of reproductive behavior. They sort of, that was their job, was to bring babies into the world. The average number of pregnancies that Stone Age women had, there are different studies that come to different numbers, but it's somewhere between 10 and 15 over the course of their reproductive life, which is mind-boggling. And not all of those pregnancies came to term, and children didn't always make it past early childhood. So they weren't raising that many children necessarily, but that's how many pregnancies they were experiencing. They were just basically pregnant the whole time that they were fertile and had that reproductive capacity. So,
right.
And they were embedded in communities that did not afford them the privilege and the luxury of self-determination, in a sense, that where they could say, I don't feel like like doing this whole thing and spending 20 years of my life knocked up. I'd rather pursue my own goals. There were really no alternatives for them. So we have this amazing gift in the modern environment where we know where babies come from. We know how to stop the creation of babies. We still get to have all of the fun of romance and sex without reproducing if we don't want to. We certainly have that ability as well if we do. But it's, we should definitely be appreciative and have gratitude that is an option to our generation when it wasn't even as recently as, even my mom or certainly my grandmother's generation.
No, I get that we have a choice, but I don't understand why we're making that choice. If it's evolutionary, we're supposed to do it. Well, I guess, too, I didn't make a conscious choice. I now don't want to have children. I'm going to do this instead. My body never wanted, I just never got that like, oh my God, I'm going to start having babies. It just never occurred to either my husband or I. And then all of a sudden, we're like, oh wow, we're like almost 50. Like, okay, I guess, anyway, skip that. Yeah. It just, why isn't it innate if that is from nature? And
yes, I see what you're saying. So I think there have always been women to whom it was not necessarily innate. So you can always think of human behavior as existing on bell curves. So bell curves, for people who don't have the post-traumatic stress from a stats class in high school, is just it's a bell-shaped curve. So it's that sort of normal curve, a distribution of data. And so with any characteristic, whether it's desire to have children, whether it's the thickness of your teeth, whether it's your eye color, anything, height, weight, it all falls on these bell curves. So the average woman, the sort of bulk of the bell curve, has some kind of reproductive drive, wants to have children at sort of an average level. But as you go out to the tails, you get fewer and fewer, where you have some women who are like baby crazy. They want children as soon as they're like 4 years old. They want to be a mommy. They're like playing with the dolls and they're mommy obsessed. So there aren't many women like that, but there are some. And then you go out to the other end of the tail, the tail of the bell curve, and you have women who have just no interest in children and never get that kind of biological clock ticking. And I'm one of those, and it sounds like you're one of those. I just kind of, I've had moments where I've idly thought like, oh, it might be interesting, but I've just never felt that kind of like, I must reproduce my genes. Like, babies are cute, but I'd much rather be an auntie and just not have the full responsibility. It's also, the expression of those preferences, whether it's with the desire to have children or really so many other things, is so contingent on your information environment. So the fact that you were aware of these alternatives. Humans are cost-benefit analytic engines. That's what humans are. But your cost-benefit analysis on whether something is worth doing, given the cost of it, it's only as good as the information that goes into that calculation. So if you make a cost-benefit calculation about having children, and you don't have a perception of anything else useful that you could do with that time and energy, you're more likely to be like, well, I might as well do it because there's nothing else really competing for my energy that would be equally or more worthwhile. But in the modern environment, particularly in the last 50 or even 20 years, there are so many alternatives available to women to live a life that does not include raising children as a central piece of it, that those pieces of information come in and they tip the scale for women who are predisposed to maybe not be as excited about having children to be more likely to take that course of action. So it's all this dynamic relationship between the ways in which you're predisposed to desire certain things and the information inputs that come into your life that shape that cost-benefit analytic process on an ongoing basis. Yeah.
I'd like to talk about the pleasure trap in terms of food. Dotsie brought up the sexual reproduction is something that we are biologically driven. We're also biologically, as you explained, driven to calorie-dense foods. So how do you, a lot of your clients as a psychology coach are dealing with having issues with eating too much food that's unhealthy, yet that's our drive. How do we temper? So many people struggle with this in the modern world because our foods they're fake. They're fake foods. They're hyper palatable. Totally. How do you use the evolutionary psychology to help somebody deal with food issues?
Yeah, well, you can think of the pleasure trap as really just explaining its addiction, essentially. So what addiction is, whether it's to highly processed food or to coffee or to alcohol or to nicotine or to heroin, it's all the same. It's all a continuum. And the mechanism by which it's working is it is hijacking the pleasure circuits of your brain. So you evolved. So you can imagine yourself in the ancestral environment. You need a guidance system to let you know if you're on track or not, because otherwise you're wasting all of your time and energy looking for the wrong kinds of foods, engaged in the wrong kinds of behavior. You need something to let you know, hey, that's a good idea, do more of that. That's a terrible idea, don't keep doing that. So pain is a key signal, but so is pleasure. And pleasure is driven primarily through dopamine signaling in the brain. So we evolved to be very beholden to the dopamine signaling of the pleasure chemicals that we get from doing things that are good for our survival and reproduction. So the main things that drive dopamine are food and sex, because it turns out you need food to survive and you can't reproduce by yourself. So we are very, very attuned to even slight little dopamine shifts, because that essentially dopamine says, that's good, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it, keep doing it. And so we get dopamine even from eating very healthy food. You could gnaw on some carrot sticks. You're going to get a little dopamine drip that lets you know, okay, all things equal, this is not the worst idea in the world. You're doing something that's beneficial for your survival and your reproduction, because you're going to live long enough to reproduce. But what happens with the highly processed food is it's blowing those dopamine receptors out of the water. It's exaggerating the pleasure signal that we're getting and telling us, you've never had a better idea. This is the best possible thing you could be doing for your survival and reproduction right now. I can't believe how lucky you are. You better eat as much of this as you can possibly get. And so we're getting this blast of dopamine that we're not adapted. We're adapted to very low levels, and now we're getting these very high levels, which is why the more dopamine you get with higher, more addictive substances, the more of a struggle it is to get out of the snare of those kinds of substances. So something like heroin or crystal meth, people can almost never come back from that, because they have so hijacked those pleasure pathways. Something like supernormal food, a processed, piece of pizza or a Twinkie or whatever it is that people are getting into is going to still hijack the pleasure pathways, but at a much lower degree, and it's much easier to break free of. So when I'm working with people, or when we're talking about this, it's understanding the process by which you've gotten ensnared is the first part. That's more than half the battle. But it's really, this is not something that you can talk your way out of or journal your way out of. It has nothing to do with how you grew up or the fact that grandma baked you cookies and you loved your grandma and you felt better when you ate those cookies. This has everything to do with your food environment. Essentially, if you have a susceptibility to the pleasure trap, to addictive foods with addictive-like properties, and that's going to be different for everybody. So everybody's got kind of a different threshold at which food starts to have this super normal pull on them. Some people can have a bite or two of super normal food and it's no big deal. Other people have one bite of a piece of chocolate and they're down the rabbit hole, can't come out for weeks at a time. They have to live a very, very clean life with really no wiggle room. So that there's a lot of individual variation there, back to the bell curve discussion. But if you kind of have to know what your set point is, what your trigger foods are, where you're likely to get into trouble, and then keep it out of your house. Chef AJ, who works with us at True North, and you guys may have had her on the show before, she has a wonderful saying that if it's in your house, it's in your mouth. And that's absolutely true. Your willpower is almost toothless here. You can have willpower to some degree to do the right thing, and if your motivation is high enough and your personality is sort of conscientious enough. So personality has a lot to do with this as well. But in the long term, success depends utterly on what's in your environment. What's in your house to snack on? If you have supernormal food, you're setting yourself up for failure.
Yeah. Can we go into you explaining esteem dynamics for us, because it has to do exactly what you're talking about, the variety of different personality types. There's 5 different ones, and they have a lot to do with social vulnerability and our sense of well-being and our ability to be resilient.
So the personality, just to back up a little bit, is we now know is almost entirely genetic. So for many years, for decades, there was this big nature-nurture debate in psychology and related disciplines. How much of who it is that we are has to do with nature, how much has to do with nurture. This was the central struggle of my whole academic history. And the pendulum really was swinging toward nurture for a long time. That's kind of, and that continues to reign supreme in most traditional psychology, certainly what we call psychodynamic psychology, which is a lot of therapists. If you just wander off the street into a therapist's office, and most of the therapy I've gotten in my life has been this variety, it's like, tell me about your childhood, like tell me about your mother, tell me about where your issues came from. You have intimacy issues because you were afraid to express yourself in a certain way, and in your home environment. So this is it continues to be the prevailing paradigm in psychology, but it's totally wrong. It's actually completely the opposite. So we now have over 15 million replicated identical twin studies. So these identical twins with exactly the same genetic profile, identical twins are not often raised apart, but sometimes they are, and it affords this amazingly powerful natural experiment to researchers to settle this question of which is more dominant, nature or nurture. Because if it's nurture, if it's the environment that these kids are growing up in, if you raise identical twins in very different households with very different rules and cultural expectations and foods, and like this family goes to the park and includes a lot of physical activity and healthy food as part of its existence. This family does not. They're a bunch of couch potatoes. They eat the standard American diet. You would expect very different outcomes for those two children if you check in with them over time, and you don't. You see a return to the baseline of the genetic predispositions of those children at an extremely high level, almost all across the board of anything that you could measure, including their personality traits. So personality, the way that we think about it in evolutionary psychology, is informed by the work in what's called behavioral genetics, which is sort of the science of how genes determine who you are. And there are 5 main categories of personality, and they spell OCEAN, so people can remember them because it's the OCEAN acronym. And this is also, if you want to find a test online, you can Google for an OCEAN personality test or something like that, should pop it up. So it's openness to experience is number 1. How conscientious you are is number 2. How extroverted versus introverted you are is number 3. How agreeable versus disagreeable you are, and how they used to call it neurotic, and now they call it negative emotionality to be a little more diplomatic about it. But that's essentially how moody you are, how emotional you are, how much amplitude you have in your emotions, both for excitement and for depression. So we measure people according to these. We call them the big 5. And this really tells us a huge amount of who you are as a human and how likely you are to have trouble with certain problems in the world, to be really successful with other things. We can make really strong predictions if we know a lot about your personality. So with the pleasure trap, with getting out of the pleasure trap and with long-term adherence and compliance with a very healthy diet, the number 1 biggest predictor is how conscientious you are. Your level of conscientiousness, all of the factors matter to some degree and make it easier or more difficult, depending. But conscientiousness, if you have a very high degree of conscientiousness, this is going to be easier for you because it's easier for you to follow rules. It's easier for you to sort of stick to a plan. Conscientiousness is all about what kind of rule follower you are, how important is it to you to do the right thing? So conscientious people pay their bills on time. Their house is clean. They follow through on their commitments relative to other people. And if they start off on a diet plan, they're much more likely to stay compliant with it. If you're below average on the bell curve for conscientiousness, you're going to have a very hard time. You're just really going to struggle. And that just means you have to go overboard with controlling your environment because you can't change who you are. You can't make yourself more conscientious. If you're a 20th percentile conscientious person, you better hope that your home environment doesn't have any crappy food in it and that you can't Instacart any and that you can't order any pizza. You got to tie your hands because you can't trust yourself. Your personality is working against your goals more than somebody who's more conscientious.
Oof. May I ask you, I just want to understand, because I've heard you say it's 100% nature who we are and it's not nurture. And I would just want to question that because I would think to survive, we would need to learn from our history, from our childhood to avoid that hot stove, be it aggressive men because our fathers were too aggressive, or in terms of food, I'm curious about why some people, like all three of us, fell into addiction, an unhealthy relationship with food or alcohol, and others don't. Is it not at all related to our childhood? Was I trying to control my food because of the story that I told you earlier about being so ill and never wanting to be ill again?
Yeah, so there's one of the books that Dr. Lyle and I often talk about on the podcast, and we use as sort of our Bible of behavioral genetics. And one of the original twin researchers was this man called Robert Plomin. And Robert Plomin is a psychologist and a geneticist, a behavioral geneticist, who wrote a book called Blueprint. And he, I think the subtitle of Blueprint is How Our DNA Makes Us Who We Are. And he has a wonderful phrase that really gets at what you're talking about, which is, he calls it the nature of nurture. So it's not like nurture comes into the equation as a learning process on top of nature, but it's not changing fundamentally who you are, but it does change how you express who you are. So in the nature of nurture is this very slippery concept that people, it's very subtle, but it's really important to understand, which is essentially, so I'm an extremely open to experience person. So if I take a Big 5 test, I'm like 96th percentile open to experience. So I'm more likely to experiment with things. I'm more likely to try beer at a party than somebody who's really not very open to experience at all. So that, combined with the fact that I do have alcoholic genes, makes me more likely to become an alcoholic. So, and I'm inheriting that openness also from my family system. So these things, it's like, it's not random that I tried beer when I did. I tried it because of who I was, because of my personality. And then I initiated a cascade of addictive behavior that was unique to my physiology and my system that I was more susceptible to than someone else might be. And so we wander into these experiences throughout life behind our all kinds of different genetic profiles that we have, which shape our experiences, which in turn shape our outcomes. But the experiences are not being randomly assigned to us, from some invisible process. They are emerging from our personality itself. So one of the comparisons that he talks about is there are all these studies that show that children who grow up in families with a lot of books around, families that read to their children, those children grow up to have a real love of learning and reading themselves. And this seems very intuitive. Like I had this experience. My father was a public radio guy, and my parents were both journalists. We grew up in a very literary sort of intellectual household. And so it seems like that's what makes me have those preferences and those desires. And if I'd grown up in a different situation, I wouldn't have them. But that's not what the twin studies show us. What the twin studies show us is I could have been raised in a family that had no interest in those things. And I would have, as long as I got the exposure to it through my life experience, wandered into the same kind of love of learning I have now. The real thing, the real mechanism is that my parents had books because they loved to read. And then they gave me those reading, loving genes. So it's following through the lineage. It's just manifesting itself in the sort of experience that people have. So there's the dynamic relationship between your genetic predispositions and the sorts of experiences that you have, both because they are emerging from who your parents are, which is where your personality is coming from, and because you're more likely to generate certain kinds of experiences for yourself over your lifetime. These things are like inextricably, completely connected. So it's more complex than just you are who you are, your genes make you who you are. They're absolutely informing each other in a mutually dynamic process.
And that would explain too, maybe like the physical aspect of that. We oftentimes hear people say, "Oh, I'm just doomed. My mom had type 2 diabetes." And, right. And then we have learned so much in terms of, type 2 diabetes and heart disease and some types of cancers that they are truly mostly foodborne illnesses, mostly, of course, not all. And that you can make that change by nurturing your diet, changing your diet.
Totally. But even something like your food preferences. So you're battling this on many fronts. So you're in a hyper normal food environment to begin with. You've got all these animal products. You have all this processed food. You have all of these things that are tapping into these ancestral, like the strongest ancestral instincts you have to survive. But then some of us have, we all have specific preferences with what kind of food we like. So if you take those twins, the same twin studies show that even if they're raised in very different, like ethnicities, and they grow up eating eating very specific ethnic cuisine in their families. We all think that we sort of like the food that we grew up with. That's sort of just an assumption that so many of us make. Even that's not true. So these children emerge from their family environment, and even though it was their childhood food, you check in on them in 20, 30 years when they have they've had the experience of other kinds of cuisines, and they've discovered their way into what they really like. They're no longer eating what they grew up with. So I have, I'm sort of genetically blessed in the sense that I come from this, Scotch-Irish gruel porridge eating stock, where I'm very happy with kind of bland starch-based foods. So that's easier for me. It's easier for me to eat an SOS-free starch-based diet because it's just more sort of genetically what I'm suited to eat, and what informs my little survival circuits that I'm doing the right thing. So many of these things are interacting, and they can look very much like a nurture effect, but they're fundamentally generally a nature effect.
You talked about how you mentioned that you used to be 100 pounds heavier and that you were an alcoholic. How did you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, well, so it's any action that humans take is, we talk about in the book that Dr. Lyle and I are writing, we talk about the motivational equation. There are kind of two pieces of motivation for people. And the first is, if you're looking at a goal, you only have a goal in life if you're estimating that accomplishing that goal is going to make a meaningful difference to your survival and or reproduction odds. Otherwise, it's not worthwhile. The cost-benefit analysis spits out its little results, and it says, no, that seems like a lot of work for not a lot of payoff, so we're not going to do it. But in my case, I was sufficiently overweight, and it was sufficiently reducing my romantic prospects, and it was causing me what I perceived to be sort of bias at work, and it was affecting my life in a lot of ways. Health issues, all of these kinds of things factor into the equation. So for me, I'm estimating if I could accomplish this goal, it would make a pretty big difference to my existence. I would be in a much better situation, evolutionarily speaking, if I could pull this off. So that's component number one of being motivated to take action on something. Component number two is what we're going to call your perceived probability of success. So how likely is it, based on all of your previous experience with trying to solve this problem, that you think you can actually do it? And different people will have a very different perceived probability of success with sticking to a healthy diet because they have varying degrees of success in their past. So evolution tells you if you've tried something 9 times and you failed every time, trying it the 10th time is probably a waste of your time and energy, because we've got a lot of data now where unless the circumstances really change to make it somehow seem more likely that we're going to be able to pull it off, it's not a good use of your time and energy to make another attempt that's just going to lead to more failure. Not just because it's a waste of time and energy, but because it's going to receive in negative feedback from the Stone Age village. People are going to watch you try, watch you fail, and judge you harshly for it. So all of those things combine to say, hey, it's better just to health at every size, fat acceptance, go lean into this kind of I'm fine just the way I am sort of thinking, rather than to take a chance on doing something that you don't think you're going to pull off. So that will plug into everybody's process. But I was I had the magical intersection of high motivation, high goal motivation in terms of the difference I thought it would make for me. And I was reintroduced to John McDougall around that time and the starch solution. And I had been vegan for many years for ethical reasons. But it was sort of rediscovering the starch solution that gave me that perceived probability of success. Because I'm like, wait a minute, I can have oatmeal and potatoes and rice and beans.
That bland food you love. Yeah.
Yeah. And this is food that is really good and that I know how to make. And so that pushes your self-efficacy up, and that gives you enough momentum to get started. And then the momentum becomes its own reward, because you start feeling really proud of yourself and you're seeing the results, you're seeing your self-efficacy increase. And it just becomes this virtuous loop where if you get all of I've heard Pam Popper call it a combination lock. You have to get all of the numbers right for it to sort of all sync up and to create that catalytic engine, that autocatalytic process of the process becomes its own reward, which is so important for a long-term journey like major weight loss.
So for really heightened supreme efficacy, or humans that are trying to create the most healthy environments for themselves, what are the combination of the ocean personalities that would be ideal? I remember you saying like conscientiousness, if you only have like 20%, it's like lock the doors.
Yeah,
because
totally.
you're not.
Yeah.
So what would be that, that personality type, the OCEAN, that would be maybe be able to create the most efficacy?
We know exactly what it is, and Dr. Lyle actually has a lecture about it called The Perfect Personality.
Okay.
And we have that on video, and we give it to people at True North. And it's I have mixed feelings about this, because it's like, I can tell you what it is, but you very likely don't have it. And so you kind of tell people what it is, and they try to become that. But the whole point is that you can't become that. Oh, you have to see where you are on each of these points, and engineer your environment to compensate for the ways that you are not these things.
So that's the point. That's why you guys give it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But the perfect personality is that you would be low on openness, because if you're high on openness, you seek adventure, you seek novelty, you want lots of different types of food. You're really interested in trying new things, going to new restaurants. So that's a problem for people. So the lower on openness you can get, the better. You want to be extremely conscientious. The more conscientious, the better. You want to be introverted for the same reason that you want to be low openness, because if you're extroverted, you have a lot of friends, they're inviting you to parties, you're going out all the time, harder to moderate your food intake. You want to be a little bit disagreeable, or quite disagreeable, because agreeable people have a very hard time setting boundaries, saying no. So I've heard Dr. Goldhammer, if people offer him something, he'll say, like, no, I don't want to eat that pus and get sick and die. Like, he's just very disagreeable. And so he has no problem telling people that he doesn't want, no, I don't want to eat your homemade cookie. Like, no. Whereas if someone's like, oh, I made you this vegan dessert just for you, it's like, okay, thanks. I have a very agreeable personality. It's very difficult for me to say no. So you want to be a little disagreeable. And you want to be quite emotionally stable, because people who are, you can think of stability as kind of, what sort of tree are you? Are you a little willow tree that's getting like all a little bit of breeze kind of causes you to sway? Or are you a mighty oak that, is resistant unless it's a hurricane? So it's like, how volatile are you to changing circumstances in your life? So the less volatile you are, the sort of sturdier you are, the easier it is to pull off, because you're less likely to be celebrating and medicating with dopamine seeking. So those characteristics just happen to describe perfectly Dr. Alan Goldhammer. That is his personality. But Dr. Lyle ran the numbers at some point, and that's like a 1 in 7,000 kind of personality, because it's quite distorted on every dimension. These are way out on the tail ends of the bell curves, and it's uniquely suited for this problem. But you've got to remember that this is a really unusual problem. This is a problem in the modern environment that we've only had collectively for the last 50 or 100 years. So that perfect personality is only perfect for this problem. It's not a perfect personality overall. Right. So whatever your personality is, it is the perfect personality for something. You wouldn't want the same person to be, an airline pilot that you would want to be a hostess at a bar. Like, those are different people. Those are different. You've got one that's very detail oriented and very focused and very, very, very conscientious and very diligent, and probably very introverted, and another who's much more gregarious and inclusive and social. And so whatever your ecological niche is for who it is that you are, life is all about finding that space and creating that space. And we call it in the book, creating your personal utopia, because you cannot change who you are. You have to change your environment. And that includes the people that you have relationships with, the kind of work that you do, the people that you work with, where you live, how you live your day to day. All of these things are environmental things that you can change.
Okay, so the personality that you just described, that is Goldhammer, is the specific personality that would be best for efficacy around food addiction.
Yeah, it just means that person struggles less to sort of, Goldhammer's the type of person who hears what to do, and he's like, okay, done. Like, okay, got it. Okay. Like, I'm having brown rice and broccoli every day. I'm not taking anybody's homemade cookies at the office potluck. I'm doing the same thing. I'm not going to any restaurants. Like, it's very easy for him.
That's my husband.
Doesn't mean that someone
1,000%. Yep.
He doesn't fall into the pleasure trap just because it's there.
He just stop anything on a dime, or start anything on a dime when it has to do with food. Like, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. And you'll see in the plant-based space that most of the sort of most successful people, particularly people who have lost a lot of weight and kept it off, and who have been really successful, have a version of that personality. They share similar characteristics for the most part. There may be a little bit of variation, but these are just the people for whom it comes more naturally.
Yeah.
But it's not impossible, because you did say that when someone has tried and tried and tried and they've kept failing, that they might give up because the village looks at them askance and says, "Oh, you're such a failure," and none of us like that. So let's talk about falling off the wagon, because I've heard you quote the 12-step program, relapse is recovery. And so what should someone do if they are that person who does well for a week or two or whatever in terms of quitting smoking or quitting the kind of foods they eat, or even alcohol? What do you recommend as in your coaching, with your clients?
Yeah, so that phrase, that relapse is part of recovery phrase, it really took me a long time to understand what that meant and what it was getting at. That what it is it's an informational process that is updating your cost-benefit analysis. So every time you relapse, you're getting information deep at the cellular level about like how much am I suffering because of this relapse, and how difficult is it to get out. And that means that the next time you're going to be less likely to relapse as much as you did that time. So that was absolutely true with my alcohol journey. I finally got sober, I think my fourth really earnest, sincere attempt. And a big part of why I was able to finally get it off the ground was that I had relapsed enough times that I had learned, okay, I really can't just have one. Like, I really can't, and this is getting harder every time. And therefore, the cost of drinking is actually higher than I thought it was. That's what relapsing taught me. And the same thing happened with food to some degree, where it used to be if I would go off the wagon with food, I'd be at an airport or something, I would just totally go down the rabbit hole and go crazy. And it's like, oh, free pass to eat whatever I want. And I've done that enough times, and I've paid the price where you wake up the next day just feeling like crap physically, feeling really terrible about yourself, paying that cost in self-esteem. All of those things add up to updating my inference about what is the real cost of that relapse relative to the benefit that I get from that supernormal food. And so my analysis of that has just gotten more and more fine-tuned to the point where now the motivation to relapse is very low. Like it's like, no, I kind of know the score here. And so I'm less likely to do it. Or if I do it, it's a much, like I'll have a couple of slices of vegan pizza, or I'll have like whatever it is that is sort of something off plan, but it's not the same kind of craziness that it used to be. And then on the other side of the equation too, I have the self-efficacy to know that I have clawed my way back before. So no matter how deep in the pleasure trap I've gotten myself, I tell my clients there's a phrase that I use, which is like, it's 4 days to freedom. So if you can get compliant and you can get your diet clean, it's going to vary for people, but the average is probably about 4 days, where it's like, really, that's 95% of the way out. You're still going to have a little bit of an attraction to the supernormal food, but if it's out of your environment and you've been doing really well, you've essentially, what you've done is you've gotten out of acute withdrawal, and then you've also started stoking the self-esteem mechanism, which is really just pride. Self-esteem is really, it's just another word for pride. It's being proud of your own efforts. And so by day 4, you wake up and you're like, man, I've got this. Like, I'm back on track. Like, I don't even know what I was doing 4 days ago. Like, everything is going the right direction now. And that restores the self-efficacy. But when you're in the middle of a relapse, it doesn't feel like that's true at all. It feels like you've lost control and you're never going to get it back. So knowing, because I've done it so many times, I have the knowledge, like however abstract it is in the middle of a relapse, like I know it's 4 days to freedom. If I can just get to day 2 and then to day 3, it's really that 1 day at a time thinking that kicks in. So relapse is a gift in that sense, where without that, I wouldn't have been as calibrated as I am to knowing that I am able to get out of it. I know my patterns. I know how I respond. I know how long it takes. And everybody's going to have their own variation, but it's going to be the same general process.
I would love to talk about the difference, or how important it is to focus more on process versus outcome.
Right.
And obviously in relation to food, but just in life as an athlete, it was critical that I stayed present in order for the outcome to be successful. And on the ESPN like 10 series doc that's going on right now, or it's been out for a bit, about Michael Jordan in The Last Dance, he's very specific in sharing that in, I think it's like the 9th episode or something, where he just has this unbelievably unique ability to only focus on what's happening now. Why would you ever focus on a shot going wrong that you haven't taken yet? Why would that ever? But that's what so many people do, right? And I certainly struggled that back and forth as an athlete, like worry and concern and fear about how the outcome might go that I haven't even ever raced yet. But I had learned to really have success. It's just right here. And then the next moment, we're just right here. Why is it so important to focus on the process for the actual outcome to be successful?
So the process, we are not evolutionarily very attuned to process. We're attuned to outcome, because outcome is where rubber hits the road with evolution. It's like whether they want to mate with us, whether they want to hire us, whether they want to be our friend. These are the sort of competitive things that we're constantly advertising ourselves and our gene quality to try to secure. So we're very outcome oriented. That is the thing that generates the biggest feelings of success or failure, is outcome oriented behavior and process. So we have to really work. We have to beat our genes. This is why we call the podcast Beat Your Genes, one of the many reasons that we do. You have to shift your attention to the process, because the process, if you're doing the fundamental tasks that are invariably going to take you to the successful outcome, you're getting a little daily dose of feedback that's going to keep you on track over time, rather than the sort of like, you're going to do really, really well for 3 days, and then you're going to fall off the wagon, and then you're going to give up, you're going to toss over the table, you're going to say, screw it, it's not worth it, I'll start Monday. But if you're in the process and you're really attuned to the daily feedback that you get, that, hey, you know what, it wasn't a perfect day, but I did do all of the things that I know if I keep doing them every day for 6 months, I will lose weight. So whether weight loss is your goal or whether it's anything else in life. So I did this even when I was writing my Ph.D. dissertation. It wasn't about, am I done with that chapter yet? Because that chapter was a very intimidating thing where I got into what Dr. Lyle and I call the ego trap, which is that it's more rational to procrastinate than it is to try, because if you try and fails, what we were talking about earlier, and you risk that judgment from the village, that's a huge evolutionary mistake. So the correct thing to do is just to sabotage and to procrastinate. So the only way out of the ego trap with any goal is to break it down into sufficiently tiny little pieces that are so doable that it's almost embarrassing to not be able to accomplish them, but it's still enough that you're proud that you did it. So it's like this real sweet spot where it's not so basic that you're like, yeah, whatever, that was no big deal, but it's enough to push you over. So for me with the dissertation, I had to move that target as a process. I started off like, I'm just going to open my laptop and stare at that screen, that blank screen, for 20 minutes. And that is effectively infinitely more than I had been doing. And so that was enough to that lit the pilot light of my self-esteem. And then it's like you move the needle up. So then it was, okay, I will write one sentence. I'll write one sentence today. And then, 100 words, 200 words, until finally I was writing 500 or 1,000 words a day. And you do that for a month and lo and behold, you have a chapter. So you just kind of trick yourself into not being intimidated by these really scary goals that you're not sure that you can accomplish or not, by breaking it down into these little constituent fundamentals, which are doable and give you daily consistent feedback that you're on track and you're making good progress toward your goals.
That really resonates with me as an athlete too. I mean, I remember so many people, don't start something because it just is so massive, whether you're going to start a business or an organization or want to get to the Olympic Games. And if I had said that, I would have just probably laughed my way not there, because it was so hilarious to think, especially with my background, that was ever going to be even a remote possibility. And so it literally was every day. I am now getting into the ice bath. I am now going to eat. I am now going to weightlift. And then a week later, I'm lifting 5 more pounds on the leg sled, because it was, every moment was just about right now, because that's just there. It would just never, ever have taken place. And if we can, it's so helpful for people, I think, to hear that, like just the right now, like what am I going to do right now? And then in 10 minutes not get any further ahead than that. And then it seems so ridiculous though. Like you said, I could really feel when you were saying, I just would stare at the blank screen. It's like, I will succeed at that because it's so minute and so
Yes.
ridiculous that I will come out a winner in that moment.
So much more than I did yesterday
Yeah.
or have been doing for the months that I've been sitting on my butt, not making any progress whatsoever. So we have a thing called Starch Targets that will give people that are just beginning to start on the plant-based diet, which is like you're trying to do 6 things every day. You're trying to eat 3 starch meals, trying to have some fruit, trying to have some vegetables, you're trying to exercise. And we're actually asking people to only hit about 80% of those. And if they hit 80% of them, they'll start feeling the positive feedback. But when you first start out, it's like, you're like, seriously, it's going to make a difference if I have to lose 200 pounds to have a bowl of oatmeal for breakfast? Are you kidding me? It feels like it's not worth it. When in fact, it's so much more than you've been doing because you've been completely off the rails. And so you have to trust, you have to get into that process orientation and trust that it becomes its own reward after a couple of days. It's really the self-esteem starts to kick in, and everybody's had this experience where they've had some goal that's really seemed out of reach, and they just gritted their teeth and they started working systematically toward it, even though it seemed really far away. By day 3, 4, 5, you're feeling good. You're impressing what we call your internal audience. Your internal audience is essentially giving you a little gold star saying, you know what, you did a good job. Keep it up. You're not self-sabotaging anymore, and I'm proud of you. So life is really a big part of life is about you want to orient your compass toward impressing that internal audience, which is judging your efforts. It's not judging your outcome.
I love that. Yay me is what you're saying, a little bit more of that and a little bit of less of bad job.
Totally.
So at True North Clinic, you were working with people who were in a very controlled environment. They're either fasting under supervision. There's no way they can go to the nearest market and go buy some junk food, or they're really eating what you serve them, which is a whole food, plant-based, high-starch, low-fat diet. No oil, no sugar, no salt. What about when, I just want to finish on, what are 3 tips that you could give people who then leave this controlled environment? Because most people are not able to go to True North, and they live in these homes that are these danger places where they've done so much damage to themselves. What do you recommend when they go home to do first thing to their environment, since you've said that is so important, or to do to their lifestyle?
Yeah, I think people try to do too much too soon in terms of getting the diet really perfect. That's a big trap that I see people get into. So they try to keep eating really True North perfect when they go home, particularly if they've been fasting for a long period of time. The body is this equilibrium seeking homeostasis machine. So if you've been eating under the hunger drive, which you have been doing if you've been fasting, you've not been eating enough calories. Your body is like, we need some calories. So I want people when they go home to not be afraid of starches. And people are so afraid of starches. So they go home and they try to eat salad. They try to have Brussels sprouts for breakfast. They try to eat this really, really super calorie dilute food that keeps them, they're eating 900 or 1,000 calories a day. And that might work for a couple of days, but day 3, when they get home, they're face down in a jar of almond butter, or they're ordering pizza. Their body just is not going to let them get away with that for any amount of time. So I ask people to really embrace the starch part of a starch-based diet, and to really eat to satiety on those wet starches. So don't be eating bread and rice crackers and other kinds of crackers or anything dehydrated and crunchy. You want to be eating potatoes, rice, quinoa, beans, squash, these sort of really satiating, really grounding, big belly filling starch meals. And what's going to happen is when you get home, you're going to feel like you're overeating. You're going to feel like you're just eating so much of it because your body's driving you that's a starches are 300 or 400 calories per pound relative to leafy greens, which are 100 calories per pound. So if you give yourself permission to eat as many potatoes as you want, you're going to eat a lot of potatoes. You're going to stuff yourself with potatoes, and you're actually going to probably see the scale go up when you get home, which is going to freak people out. But that's just water weight. It's just the glycogen that you're storing because you're eating a lot of glucose and a lot of starch. It's not fat. You're not gaining fat from this process. And if you allow yourself just to eat to satiety on those full, nourishing, satiating starches, after a few days, you're not going to be stuffing yourselves on them. It's like it becomes, you convince your nervous system, we've got enough food, everything's cool. So that would be tip number one, is don't try to be super perfect and live on broccoli and salad when you get home. Like, embrace the starches. And the second thing is, clean out that environment. So you don't want to get to day 3 where you've been eating starches, even if you're eating to satiety on them, and you've got a TV dinner in the fridge or in the freezer, you have something that's kind of been calling your name that is super normal that you're excited about. Don't put yourself through that. This is the hardest thing that you can do anyway in terms of fighting every natural instinct that you have. Don't set yourself up to fail. So if you have food, or if a spouse has food, or if your kids have food, you've got to get that environment just as clean as possible. When you still have the willpower, when you come home, when you're like, I'm doing this, take advantage of that, leverage that feeling to clean up everything, because you're not going to have that same feeling where you want to get that food out of your environment in 2 days. And if it is not your food, it's like if you're sharing space with a spouse or with kids or whatever it is, you've got to do whatever you have to do to make this possible for you. And that's going to be different according to everybody. It depends on your level of conscientiousness. If you have conscientiousness where a bag of frozen cashews in the freezer is not going to be calling your name all the time. Alan Goldhammer has that personality. You probably don't, but if you do, that's fine. Don't worry about it. But if you know that that's a trigger food for you, and just because you have the willpower now, don't count on having it in a week. You've got to get it. You got to get that environment clean. So I will have clients, have their spouse lock up trigger food, like literally get like a trunk that has a lock on it to keep the stash of the junk food that the spouse likes. You have to pursue unusual solutions to face this unusual problem, because you cannot rely on your willpower. You cannot change your personality. You have barbarians at the gate with a battering ram trying to get in and trying to take advantage of these strong instincts that you have, and you've got to be really creative to defeat it. So be really draconian about controlling your environment, and then practice some of the rehearsal, the little scripts that we have if social issues are a problem. I mean, we're sort of in post-pandemic world now, so people are less defeated by social issues than they have been before, probably. But a lot of people really struggle with going out to lunches at work or family events where people are being pushy. And we have some tools on our website at esteemdynamics.com to help people kind of script out how to deal with pushy people. And the general piece of advice is that you want to avoid threatening other people's esteem and status, and make yourself look like you kind of don't know what you're doing, which is a very counterintuitive thing to do, because we all want to seize as much status as we can all the time. But if you say something like, oh, this is just something I'm trying, and I don't know, my doctor thought it'd be a good idea, and I don't know if it's a good idea, but I'm just going to give it a try. You take the threat to that other person away, and they're less likely to push back against you. It's just a little bit of Jedi mind trickery that we have for dealing with pushy people. So if you've got people who are being like, well, where are you getting your protein from? And, don't you think you're going to waste away on this diet? It's just, I don't know, maybe, but it seems to be working right now, so I'm just going to keep giving it a try. We call that blame Big Louie.
I've heard Dr. Lyle talk about that in a talk. Yes. Yeah, it's just like, fantastic.
Well, wow, you've given us so much amazing information, and thank you so much, Dr. Jen Howk. And everybody should listen to her podcast with Dr. Lyle, Beat Your Genes, and we're looking forward to your book.
Awesome. Well, it's great to be here, and anytime I'm happy to answer all these questions and anything else.
So thank you so much for tuning in today. If we helped you in any way, then click the subscribe button and let's keep hanging out together. We have so much more to share with you.
And if you need more information on actually making the switch for good, please visit us at switchforgood.org for loads of info. And you can subscribe to our mailing list where you will receive all sorts of super cool gifts, discount codes to our very fave dairy-free products, and a lifetime of powerful health tips.
So join us on the journey to switch for good. This is the future.